We tend to believe that the first humans lived an average of only 25 years. We usually imagine their lives as short, harsh, and brutal, as if people matured the moment they were born, immediately began to age, and disappeared before ever reaching the age of 30. But was it really like this? Was human life in the past truly limited to just 25 years? In this video, we will look for an answer to that question. When the human mind encounters information such as the average life expectancy was 25 years, it simplifies it into a single conclusion: early humans lived for 25 years. But the reality is not quite so straightforward, because average life expectancy mostly reflects the conditions under which people were born, not necessarily how they lived. In the past, being a baby was extremely dangerous. Infections that we consider trivial today, a minor injury, or even a few days of diarrhea, could be fatal thousands of years ago. The loss of either the mother or the baby during childbirth was very common. For this reason, we know that in prehistoric societies, 1 out of every 2 babies died before reaching the age of 5. This was the main factor pulling average life expectancy down. In other words, death usually did not occur on its own, but as the result of a specific cause. Interestingly, for those who managed to survive childhood, the situation could be completely different. An individual who reached the age of 10 or 15 often had a much longer life ahead than we tend to assume. Therefore, to understand how long people in the past actually lived, it is more accurate to look not at life expectancy at birth, but at the remaining life expectancy of individuals who had already passed a certain age. This perspective brings us closer to a more realistic understanding of how long early humans truly lived. Communities that still maintain a hunter-gatherer lifestyle today provide valuable insight into this issue. Studies conducted on many independent groups living on different continents show that a significant portion of children survive to adolescence. Among those who reach the age of 15, a large number go on to live into their 40s. Moreover, although life expectancy at birth is low in these societies, it is well known that a considerable number of individuals who reach adulthood live into their 60s. The information we obtain from these communities seriously challenges the idea that people in the past could not grow old. Instead, it suggests that aging is not so much a biological limit as it is a social process. In other words, an individual who lives with others and shares knowledge and labor has a much higher chance of survival than someone who lives alone. So what do we see when we examine the causes of death in these societies? The first answer that comes to mind is disease. However, unlike the major epidemics seen in the densely populated cities of the modern world, these illnesses mostly appear as simple infections. The reason is that infectious diseases spread far less in small, tightly knit groups. In addition, a large proportion of deaths result from injuries, infections caused by those injuries, and accidents. Violence and animal attacks are common examples. Diseases associated with old age are relatively rare, simply because the proportion of people who reach old age is already quite low. If we take the Aboriginal peoples of Australia as an example, we see that despite harsh environmental conditions, high infant mortality, and frequent conflicts, there were individuals who reached advanced ages. The general life expectancy was around 40 years. But this did not mean that everyone died at 40. We know that some individuals lived into their 70s, 80s, and even 90s. Although the secret of long life in those times remains unclear, the role that elders played in these societies helps shed light on the issue. Were they a burden on the community or an indispensable source of guidance? In societies with limited resources, the mere presence of elders is enough to show that they represented the collective memory of the group. They knew which animals could be found in which season, which plants were poisonous, and when the weather would change. they guided their communities. In this way, they secured a respected place within the group and were valued, even if their physical strength had declined. Of course, human history is not a romantic fairy tale. During times of famine, prolonged droughts, or extreme cold, some communities were forced to make very difficult decisions. In some cases, elderly individuals willingly stayed behind for the survival of the group. But such honorable examples were not always the norm. In certain situations, elders were neglected, abandoned, or ignored. Still, these practices were not universal rules throughout human history. They were exceptions born out of extreme conditions. To summarize, people in the past did not simply drop dead once they reached the age of 30. Death was more common in the early stages of life. But aging was indeed possible. And those who did grow old were not merely survivors. They were individuals who guided their communities. Human history has been shaped not only by the physical strength of the young, but also by the wisdom of the old. At this point, it is time to rewind the story of humanity a little further, because the answer to this question is not limited to our own species. Were those who came before us also able to age? And if so, what does that mean? Let us take a look at that as well. The picture that emerges at first glance is intimidating. Fewer tools, more danger, larger predators, harsher climates. Yet fossil records show that not only young and strong individuals, but also old and fragile ones managed to survive. This means that human species that lived long before us were also able to age. And more importantly, they were allowed to age. Let us consider one of the most striking examples. Homo erectus. Emerging around 2 million years ago, this species was one of the most successful human species in Earth's history. It left Africa and spread into Asia and Europe. It controlled fire, used tools, and adapted to harsh environments. But the true success of Homo erectus lay not only in individual development, but in social development as well. The fossils found in the Dmanisi region of Georgia may help clarify this issue. In the remains of an elderly individual believed to date back approximately 1.8 million years, a striking detail has been observed. All of this individual's teeth were missing, and the tooth sockets had closed with bone tissue, indicating that this person had lived without teeth for a long time. For a toothless individual to survive alone under the conditions of that period would have been nearly impossible. When we consider the dietary conditions of the time, foods requiring great endurance, such as tough plants or raw meat, come to mind, none of which would have been suitable for a toothless body. It is therefore understood that this individual was fed, protected, and kept within the group by others. In other words, in Homo erectus communities, elderly and weak individuals were not abandoned, but instead sustained. This represents not only a biological success, but a human choice. These people, who had no knowledge yet of language, art, or writing, were already beginning to form social rules. A similar picture can be seen among Neanderthals. Long labeled as primitive, these people are now understood to have had highly complex social lives. Hundreds of Neanderthal fossils discovered to date reveal individuals who suffered severe injuries, became disabled, and yet lived for many years. Healed fractures, mended wounds, and missing limbs in the remains clearly indicate this. For example, let us consider the Shanidar, one individual found in Iraq. It is thought that he lost his right arm due to traumatic amputation, that part of his face was paralyzed, and that he was therefore most likely partially blind and almost completely deaf. Considering the injuries to his legs, it is assumed that walking was nearly impossible for him. Hunting, self-defense, or gathering food would have been extremely difficult. Despite this individual survived for decades. This shows that Shanidar I was not alone, that there were people who fed him, protected him, and kept him within the group. Moreover, when these examples are examined, they can be multiplied. Other Neanderthal fossils found in France and Spain present a similar picture. The existence of individuals who had lost their teeth showed severe signs of arthritis and reached advanced ages. People who could not have survived without community support. Strengthens the argument that care for the elderly was not an exception, but a systematic behavior. What about modern humans, our own species, Homo sapiens? We know that Homo sapiens shared the world with Neanderthals for a long time. In the early periods, life expectancy was not very different from theirs. Until the Upper Paleolithic, the number of individuals who reached advanced ages was quite limited. But this does not mean that aging was impossible, only that it was difficult. When we examine the evidence, we see that cultural and technological developments gradually began to change this picture. Better tools, more effective hunting methods, shelters, and clothing undeniably increased chances of survival. In fossils from this period, individuals who reach their 40s and 50s appear more frequently. Cro-Magnon humans are a good example of this. Elderly individuals show joint diseases, healed fractures, and chronic conditions. In other words, they aged. And despite aging, they were not abandoned. By the time we reach the agricultural revolution, everything changes. Humans adopt settled life, populations grow, and societies expand. In some respects, this makes life easier. However, it also brings new problems, such as reduced dietary diversity, the spread of epidemics, and the emergence of social inequality. Interestingly, in some regions during this period, life expectancy appears to have been lower than that of hunter-gatherers. In other words, progress does not always mean a longer life. Still, over time, immune systems strengthen, medical knowledge increases, and human lifespan gradually extends. At the core of this long process, we can clearly see the truth that humans have been able to age as long as they lived together with others. Elderly individuals became carriers of knowledge, ensured cultural continuity, and formed the memory of communities. In conclusion, people were able to age in the past as well. Not everyone, but those fortunate enough could live for a long time after reaching maturity. And aging, contrary to common belief, was not about muscle strength, but about social bonds. Communities that valued the elderly, protected them, and respected their knowledge laid the foundations not only for individual survival, but also for collective life. Perhaps the greatest achievement in human history is not lighting fire or making tools. Perhaps the true achievement was learning not to abandon the weak. Because what makes us human is not how long we live, but how we keep one another alive. If you have watched the video this far, please do not forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Until the next video, take care.